You arrived in this family with nothing, Neva. So pick up whatever you brought and leave exactly the same way. Heloise Marchant, 64-year-old mother of Corwin and self-appointed guardian of the Marchant family name, pulled a folded cashmere sweater from the open suitcase and threw it directly at her daughter-in-law's face. The fabric struck Neva across the cheek and dropped to the polished pine floor of Lakebrook Lodge's main sitting room. Neva Reese Marchant, 34-year-old wife of Corwin, stood near the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the dock. September had turned the birch trees pale gold. The lake below was steel grey and still. She pressed 2 fingers to her cheek and looked at her husband. Corwin Marchant, 39, Executive Vice President of Property Developments at Hearthstone Group, stood with his back to the stone place. He was not standing between his wife and his parents. He was standing beside Solange Ferris, 32, Director of Brand Partnerships at Hearthstone Group, and Corwin's affair of at least 2 years, close enough that their sleeves touched. Desmond Marchant, 68, founder and public chairman of Hearthstone Group, lifted another of Neva's blouses from the suitcase and draped it over the arm of the leather sofa with the deliberate, unhurried indifference of a man who expected everyone in the room to accept his authority as naturally as they accepted the weather. He had never once thought to question whether the room itself belonged to him. "Corwin." Neva's voice came out flat and composed. "Are you going to say anything?" He looked at the fireplace grate. "Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be." Halton Graves, 61, Desmond's personal solicitor and a man who had spent 3 decades helping the Marchant family arrange things in their favor, placed a thin folder on the side table beside the window. Inside it was a divorce petition and a proposed settlement. He offered Corwin a pen. Corwin took it. He looked at Neva once, not with guilt, not with apology, but with the flat impatience of someone closing a meeting that had already run too long. Then he signed the petition and the settlement after it while Solange stood beside the fireplace with her hand resting lightly on the stone mantel. Neva looked at the folder without touching it. Heloise reached into the suitcase again. The button on a jacket sleeve caught Neva across her temple as it flew past, hard enough to sting, hard enough to leave a mark. No one moved to stop it. No one said a word. What the Marchant family did not know, what Corwin had never thought to ask, because he had looked at Neva's quiet wardrobe and her sensible car and her comfortable silences and decided the full picture of her was already visible, was that Neva's father, Ewan Rees, had been one of the most quietly powerful property investors in the country. Ewan had built his fortune not through headlines but through infrastructure, industrial land assemblies, hospitality assets in northern Ontario, mixed-use developments across 3 provinces, and a portfolio of resort properties that other investors consistently underestimated because Ewan preferred it that way. He had kept Neva away from the public side of his business throughout her childhood. She had studied under her mother's surname, Neva Riss, never publicly linked to the holdings Ewan controlled. Before he died, he placed everything inside the Rees Property Trust and named Neva its sole beneficiary and managing director. 19 months earlier, when Hearthstone Group's debt had outpaced its revenues and 3 major lenders were threatening simultaneous enforcement action, Neva had authorized the trust to acquire an 81% controlling interest in the company. Desmond had been permitted to remain public chairman during a supervised transition period so that employees, lenders, and guests would not panic. He had shaken hands on the agreement. He had signed it. He had thanked the unnamed investment group in a press release that called them visionaries, and he had told his board that Hearthstone's future had never looked stronger. He had been thanking his daughter-in-law. By signing the divorce petition at Lakebrook Lodge, with Solange at his side and his parents scattering his wife's clothes across the floor, Corwin had not removed a woman with nothing from his future. He had separated himself from the person whose trust had been keeping his family's company solvent for the past year and a half. Demi O.C., 29, Neva's personal assistant, had parked near the service lane as Neva had asked. When Neva came down the service stairs 10 minutes later carrying her own bag, a blouse still on the sitting room floor, a jacket still draped over the sofa arm, Demi didn't say anything. She took the bag, put it in the trunk and drove. They were past the Gravenhurst turnoff before Neva's shoulders stopped being rigid. Neva had met Corwin at a property development conference in Ottawa 7 years earlier. She had been attending under the Trust's advisor credentials, not under her own name, watching a panel on heritage building conversion in the old conference centre on Elgin Street. During the mid-morning break, a senior developer in the lobby had begun loudly reprimanding a young intern for passing him the wrong briefing package. The intern was 22 at most, holding a coffee tray, trying to keep her face neutral. The developer was still going when Corwin walked over, took the briefing package out of the intern's hand, looked at it for 3 seconds, and said to the developer, "It's the right package. You're looking at last year's label." Then he thanked the intern by name and carried his own coffee back to his table without waiting to be acknowledged. Corwin had not known Neva was watching. He hadn't known she was anyone. That was why it had mattered. Ewan had warned her about exactly this. He had taken her into the main room of his first Muskoka property, an old outfitter's lodge he'd converted over 7 winters, and said, "The moment someone knows what you have, you will never again know what they want from you." He kept her out of the company's public records. He taught her to read a balance sheet before she was old enough to sign a lease. He made sure she understood the difference between inheriting wealth and understanding it. Before she married Corwin, Neva had told him her father had left her a private property trust under professional management. Corwin had nodded and moved on to something else. He had assumed it was modest. A few Ontario rental properties, maybe a small commercial space, because Neva didn't live the way his family expected wealthy women to live, and he had mistaken her restraint for the absence of anything worth restraining. Desmond had insisted on a prenuptial agreement Neva had signed without protest. The agreement protected each spouse's inherited and separate assets. Desmond believed he was protecting Hearthstone from a woman with little to offer. He had, without realizing it, protected the Risk Property Trust from his own son. The crisis arrived 6 weeks before Lakebrook Lodge. Neva had been working from the Trust Toronto office on a Tuesday morning when Clem Howarth, 44, Hearthstone's chief operating officer, sent a message marked urgent. Clem was one of 3 people within Hearthstone who knew Neva's actual position. She had earned that knowledge 19 months earlier during the acquisition when she had looked directly at Neva across a boardroom table and asked, "Who are you, actually?" And Neva had told her. The message said, 14 construction draws have been suspended. 3 hotel renovation projects are on hold pending payment. The supplier is giving us 48 hours. Neva called her back. The draws were supposed to clear last Friday, Clem said. Vance redirected the funds. Vance Quellet, 53, Hearthstone's chief financial officer, had been Corwin's mentor since Corwin joined the company at 29. He controlled the company's operating accounts under authority delegated during the supervised transition period, and he had spent 2 decades arranging the numbers in ways that protected the Marchant family's interests without ever quite crossing lines that could be traced back to a single clear decision. "Where did the money go?" Neva asked. A pause, the kind that preceded answers that were both specific and uncomfortable. Part of it went to an interior design contract for Lakebrook Lodge. The rest covered a brand activation event that Solange organized in Banff last month. Neva set her pen down on the desk. The Lakebrook renovations had been presented to the board as a leadership retreat investment. Costs to be covered through the lodge's own operating account. Corwin had told her this directly. Apparently he had not told her the truth. How long before the supplier files? 42 hours now. Neva authorized a direct payment from the trust's emergency facility, $11 million, transferred to the supplier's account rather than through Hearthstone's general ledger. She did not want the money passing through accounts that Vance could touch. Then she called Rafferty Dunn, 57, the trust's lead independent director and the person who had worked alongside her since Ewan's death. "The board needs to know," Rafferty said. "The board will know when the projects are stabilized, and I understand how far this goes," Neva replied. "I'm not making decisions publicly before I have the full picture." She did not authorize the payment because Hearthstone deserved another rescue. She authorized it because 400 construction workers were scheduled to return to site on Thursday morning, and it was not their disruption to absorb. The gala was 3 weeks before Lakebrook. Hearthstone's annual foundation dinner at a venue on King Street in Toronto, the kind of event where the speeches ran long and the tablecloths cost more than they should. A courier had delivered a garment bag to Neva's hotel room the afternoon before. Inside was a dress, beige, ill-fitting, chosen to be unremarkable, with a card from Heloise that said, in her careful cursive, "Thought this might suit the occasion better than your usual choices." There had been other events, across 6 years of this marriage, where Neva had rejected Heloise's gifts and then spent weeks absorbing the fallout. She wore the beige dress. Before dinner, Oren Blatch, 38, Hearthstone's head of communications, hired by Desmond and apparently authorized to make decisions that included Neva, directed the family toward the main staircase for a series of photographs. A display board behind them read, "Hearthstone's next chapter." Desmond stood at the center. Corwin stood to his left, Heloise stood to the right. Solange, whose presence at a family gala had been introduced to Neva as a senior brand consultant, stood beside Corwin with the ease of someone who had stood there before. Oren asked Neva to please step aside. "These photographs are for leadership profiles," he said. "We're keeping it to core stakeholders." Neva looked at Heloise, who had never held a role at Hearthstone in 30 years. She looked at Corwin. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and said nothing. She stepped back out of the frame. The camera flashed twice. Later in the evening, when Solange offered Neva a glass of wine, she was wearing a pendant around her neck. A small gold architect's compass on a fine chain, catching the light from the gala chandeliers. 2 months earlier, Corwin had asked to help him fund something for a retiring senior project director who had spent 31 years with Hearthstone. Neva had found this piece at a jewelry studio in the distillery district. She had had the clasp adjusted because the original sat crooked at the back. She looked at the pendant. She could see engraving on the inside face, but could not read it from where she stood. When Corwin left the main floor, and Solange followed 3 minutes later, Neva crossed the room and climbed one flight to the mezzanine bar. The door was partially open. Through the gap, she watched Corwin hold the pendant between his fingers while Solange stood beside the window. She couldn't hear every word, but she heard. Soon, and she heard. After Lakebrook, and then she saw him kiss her, and she stood in the corridor hallway, unable to move for longer than she expected. She remembered the night Hearthstone nearly missed payroll, the night Corwin had driven home at 2 in the morning and sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet. She had stayed awake beside him until he fell asleep, and then she had gone to her desk and called Rafferty. Before sunrise, the acquisition process had begun. She had risked the trust's capital to protect workers she had never met, to preserve a company she did not yet control, and to save the man she loved from watching his family's life's work collapse. Now she was standing in a corridor outside a mezzanine bar, watching him plan to replace her. The invitation to Lakebrook Lodge had been framed as a family reconciliation. Corwin said his parents wanted to clear the air. He said the September drive up the 400 was beautiful, which was true. She had held on to that longer than was reasonable. She had allowed herself to believe there was still a version of this that ended with an honest conversation. What she had not understood was how rehearsed everything would be. The lunch where her place card had been moved to the far end of the table. Solange, installed in the room beside Corwin's, listed in the guest manifest as a corporate advisor. Holton Graves arriving that afternoon with his briefcase. Every detail arranged before Neva had even turned off the highway onto the gravel road. When she arrived, the lodge's general manager, a careful woman named Bev who had worked for the property for 12 years and who had never treated Neva as a guest of lesser importance, greeted her in the entry hall and held her gaze for just a moment longer than protocol required. The sitting room where the family gathered had been covered by disclosed recording equipment since Hearthstone's board had required video documentation for all executive governance events held at the property. Bev had already forwarded a preserved copy to outside legal counsel before the afternoon was over, before Desmond could think to ask for the files to be cleared. None of that changed what happened on the sitting room floor. Orla Shand, 48, Neva's attorney since Ewan's death, arrived at the Trust's Toronto apartment before 10 that night. She read the petition and settlement in under 15 minutes, then set them down. The separate property clause, she said, Desmond's idea. He wanted to protect Hearthstone from me. Orla looked up. He protected the Reese Trust from Corwin. Every inherited asset you hold stays untouched. Every premarital holding, every separate account. You cannot be compelled to surrender the Trust's 81% interest in Hearthstone as part of this settlement. She turned the document over. He did you a favor. Neva was sitting on the floor beside the armchair. She hadn't meant to sit there, but she had stopped performing steadiness sometime after Orla arrived. Heloise hit me with a jacket sleeve, she said. Not Corwin, but he watched. Orla set her coffee down. They were standing in a lodge that was renovated with redirected Hearthstone construction funds, Neva continued. Funds pulled from drawers that should have paid contractors, and Desmond stood there and told me I'd arrived with nothing. Orla issued litigation hold notices to both Hearthstone Group and Lakebrook Lodge Limited before midnight. All financial records, communications, travel manifests, and video from the lodge's disclosed cameras were preserved under court instruction before anyone could think to request their deletion. The independent committee's work took 3 weeks. Vance had redirected operational funds to cover lodge renovations and Solange's brand events, recording them as approved corporate expenditures. He had delayed supplier payments 4 times in 8 months to maintain liquidity for Marchant family costs. Corwin had approved private hotel stays and listed them as business development travel. He had pressured a junior finance analyst to reclassify expenses, dinners, weekend bookings, 2 sets of custom luggage that had nothing to do with business development. His emails showed he had known about Vance's redirections and had not corrected the record. Solange had charged the architect's compass pendant, 3 other pieces of jewelry, 2 private air charters, and 11 hotel nights to Hearthstone's marketing budget. Oren had created documentation making those costs appear connected to brand campaigns. In one message to Corwin, Oren had written, "Once the announcement goes through, we clean the records. No one looks too closely at a new chairman's first quarter." At Lakebrook, none of them knew this file was growing. Desmond had scheduled a corporate aircraft departure from Toronto Pearson, an investor roadshow to Vancouver and Calgary, during which Corwin's chairmanship would be announced. The timing was deliberate. The announcement would be made while Desmond's protected transition period was technically still active before the trust's independent board could convene a formal response. He had read the transition agreement and found what he believed was the window. Rafferty had read the same agreement. He found different language. The notices reached Lakebrook Lodge on a Thursday evening. Desmond read the first page and told Helois it was a procedural formality. Corwin called his solicitor and was told to attend the compliance meeting the following morning. Vance had his system credentials suspended before he finished reading his notice. Solange saw the subject line of her termination letter and left it unopened because she was choosing earrings for the Vancouver photographs. The following morning, 3 cars arrived at the Pearson private terminal. Desmond stepped out wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man who believed that his arrival was, itself, an argument. Helois followed. Corwin came last, with Solange beside him, both of them moving toward the terminal entrance as though the day was already decided. The access reader flashed red. Corwin tried again, red. The gate attendant, a woman named Bria, who had worked for Hearthstone's aviation division for 14 years, remained behind the glass partition and said, without apology, "I can't clear you through. The board has issued a revised passenger list. Your names have been removed." Desmond placed his palm flat against the glass. "I founded this company. Your access credentials were suspended at midnight, sir. I'm following written board instruction. I am the board." Bria's expression did not shift. "The independent committee's resolution supersedes executive discretion on travel authorization. I have it in writing." The corporate aircraft sat on the apron with its stairs folded and its cabin door closed. Desmond crossed the tarmac boundary and demanded the captain lower them. The captain, a man named Dell, shook his head and said he was unable to board passengers not on the revised manifest and that the insurer had been explicit. The family's luggage remained on the ground. While Desmond's voice rose and Corwin cycled through unanswered calls, a group of vehicles cleared the airside gate. Independent directors stepped out. Rafferty followed, and beside him came Orla. And from the last vehicle, stepping out onto the tarmac and walking toward the family at the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time she needed, came Neva. She wore a dark coat and low boots. She had not brought anyone to stand around her. She walked across the apron and stopped beside Rafferty. Desmond pointed at her and said something about removal. Nobody moved. Rafferty waited until Desmond had finished, then spoke clearly. "The controlling shareholder is present. She has been the controlling shareholder for the past 19 months. He continued. Neva Riss Marchant is the managing director and sole beneficiary of the Riss Property Trust. The trust acquired 81% of Hearthstone Group's voting shares during the company's debt restructuring. The agreement you signed, Desmond, the one that kept you in the chairman's office while Hearthstone stabilized, expired at midnight." Helois turned to look at Neva. Corwin stared at his wife. "Your father was Ewan Rees," Corwin said. "Not a question. The sentence of someone who had finally listened to something said to them years ago." "Yes. You told me he left you a trust." "I did. You decided you already knew what was in it." Desmond had tried to secure financing from one of Ewan's holding companies years ago. The application had been declined because Desmond's leverage ratios were too aggressive and his governance structure was too informal. He had told people afterward that Ewan Rees's advisors lacked the vision to recognize opportunity. He was standing on a tarmac that belonged to Ewan's daughter. Holton Graves arrived from the side entrance and read from a prepared statement. Corwin's suspension pending the committee's final review. Solange's termination. Vance's suspension and referral for civil examination, Oren's termination for falsified expense documentation, and for an attempted media campaign against Neva that had been identified and stopped before any outlet published it. Lakebrook Lodge, its debt secured in part through unauthorized Hearthstone guarantees, was under lender review and restructuring assessment. When Halton was finished, Hellis's voice came out smaller than Neva had ever heard it. "We gave 30 years to this company." Neva answered her directly. "I know that, and I saved it when your husband's decisions made saving necessary." She did not say it with satisfaction. She said it because it was the truth, stated plainly, which was something the Marchant family had always treated as negotiable. Corwin found Neva in the private meeting room off the terminal's east corridor. He closed the door and stood with his back against it. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. If I had known, that's what I needed to find out." She was not angry when she said it. She was tired in the way that only comes from spending years trying to sustain something that had been hollowing out from the inside. "I didn't keep it from you to test you. I kept it private because my father taught me to, and because I wanted to know whether I was loved for reasons that had nothing to do with what I controlled. But it also meant that when you were careless with me, you were careless without any of the excuses that could have complicated things." Corwin sat down. For the first time since she had known him, there was no meeting to redirect toward, no version of himself to maintain. "The night your father called you about the debt," Neva said. "You drove home at 2 in the morning. You sat on the kitchen floor." He nodded. "Before it was light, I had authorized the acquisition. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting the people who would have lost their pensions, the contractors who would have gone unpaid. But I let you believe strangers had saved the company because it was easier than explaining why I had made a unilateral decision about my inheritance on behalf of your family." She paused. "I should have told you then. I'm not certain it would have changed anything. But I should have." "The night you sat on the kitchen floor," he said quietly. "I came home because I didn't know where else to go." "I know. And you were there." "I was always there." He didn't argue with what came next, because there was nothing to argue with. When she stood to leave, he said, "Is there anything?" "No," quietly, firmly, the boundary she should have placed years before and had not and now did. The independent committee completed its review in 6 weeks. Corwin's suspension became permanent termination. Vance faced civil claims for the redirected construction funds. Oren's termination was upheld after investigators recovered the edited video he had attempted to send to media outlets before Orla's preservation notice stopped him. Halton withdrew from representing the family, preserved his records, and cooperated with lawful subpoenas. Lakebrook Lodge entered controlled restructuring. It was eventually sold to meet the lender obligations that Desmond's personal guarantees had created. Desmond lost the chairmanship permanently. The public explanation was factual and contained no editorializing from Neva. Clem became Hearthstone's interim CEO because she understood the operations and had protected the company when others had treated it as a family account. Rafferty was formally confirmed as the trust's representative to Hearthstone's independent board. Together they introduced protected reporting channels, separated family relationships from executive approvals, created quarterly expense disclosure requirements for corporate travel, and established an employee profit share tied to property performance. Neva did not appoint herself to anything she had not already held. Months after the tarmac, a letter arrived at the trust's office in Corwin's handwriting. He did not ask to reconcile. He did not name Solange Vance or his parents as the explanation for what had happened. He wrote that he had spent a long time understanding the distance between the moment he had stopped being the person she married and the moment she had stopped waiting for him to return, and that those were not the same moment. He wrote that his greatest loss was not the position or the corporate residence or the access card that no longer worked. It was understanding that when he had been at his most frightened, she had been at her most generous, and he had never once thought to ask why. Neva read the letter twice. She placed it in the same drawer where she kept the photo she'd found in the Ottawa conference archive. Blurry, taken by a stranger, showing a younger Corwin crouched on a lobby floor beside an intern who was holding a coffee tray, doing something decent when he thought no one important was watching. She kept both. Not because anything could be repaired, because she was not willing to reduce 6 years to a clean story about a woman who had always known better. Some mornings she drove north to the lodge on the north shore of Lake Muskoka. Ewan's first property, the old outfitter's building he'd converted over 7 winters. The place where he had taught her to read a balance sheet on the same table where guests later ate breakfast overlooking the water. She would stand in the main room where the exposed beams still carried the marks of the original roof bolts and think about the version of herself who had once signed a prenuptial agreement without protest because she had understood what it actually protected even when Desmond did not. She had always known what she had. What she learned at 34, on the pine floor of a sitting room in Muskoka, with her clothes scattered around her and her husband's signature still wet on a piece of paper, was that she had always deserved to be treated as though that mattered, not because of the trust, not because of Hearthstone, not because of her father's name or the 81% that had quietly underwritten every room in that lodge. Simply because she was there. And that should always have been reason enough. When the employee profit share program was announced, a message came from Rafferty. Full uptake across all properties. The maintenance and housekeeping teams at the Muskoka Lodge have asked if you'd come for lunch. She drove up the 400 on a Friday, past Barrie, where the highway opened and the sky went wide, and ate at a long table with mechanics and housekeeping staff, and 2 junior reservations managers who had been with Hearthstone since before the restructuring. A groundskeeper named Wes, 41 years with the company, stood without ceremony and said, "We kept working because someone made sure we could. It's good to finally know who that was." Neva thanked him. She didn't make a speech. On the drive home, she passed the road that turned toward Lakebrook. She did not slow down.